Phase 4 is going to make or break Season of Discovery, and we're going to dive into the reasons why. As we know, according to the timeline Blizzard put out a good while back, Phase 4 of Season of Discovery is due to drop after the launch of Cataclysm on May the 20th. So we can probably assume anywhere from the end of May to the first few weeks of June is going to be when Phase 4 arrives. And honestly, for the majority of the player base, it couldn't come soon enough. Now, I know there's going to be some people say it needs to be longer, I'm not level 50, I haven't done this or I haven't done that. And I totally get it, I completely understand where you're coming from. However, the fact of the reality is, this phase has the most content drought out of all 3 phases so far. It feels like a mini phase, a pit stop so to say, before another real phase drops. Phase 1, in most players' eyes, was the most interesting, the most creative and the most fun. And it's easy to see why. At that time, Season of Discovery was a brand new concept of discovering runes, everyone trying to figure out all new stuff within the world, a ton of player interaction to help each other out, a low barrier to entry into 10-man raiding, and so many more great things. But the best part about it was that everyone was in this kind of experience of joy and just fundamentally enjoying the game. Phase 2 came along and somewhat carried on parts of what made Phase 1 so good. There was again new content, the level 40 bracket felt like a good pit stop. As you were accessing multiple new dungeons, you got your first mount. A lot of the new runes really helped prop up and flesh out some classes that were struggling. The Blood Moon PvP event, for the amount of criticism it received and for how laggy it could be at times, was actually a very good and fresh experience to an open world PvP event. But this is also where some issues started to come to light and some players started to become unsatisfied. With Gnomeregan feeling a little too hard or feeling a little bit too much like retail WoW, some classes being glaringly broken for way too long in both PvE and PvP, some classes feeling extremely underwhelming in raids, particularly due to the amount of excess armor given to bosses in the Gnomeregan raid, the amount of gatekeeping that started to become prevalent with log checking and with what class and spec you play, and just generally the slower rate in which the developers tackled some of these issues had made some players lose the trust as to where the direction of Season of Discovery was heading. But despite this, Phase 2 still had a decent amount of content and some hope for future phases. But then moving on to Phase 3, we didn't really get a whole lot of new content. Firstly, we were sped through the leveling process with 50% increased experience, and especially with the incursions, which we'll touch on more in a little minute. But although I'm not against the Discoverer's Delight, the experience buff in any kind of way, the problem really comes from when your first character going through that leveling bracket and you reach a level cap a lot faster only to find out there's not much new content outside of a new raid. I feel like it only further hindered the player experience at level 50, which, as unlike previous phases, there was no new PvP event as it was just the same recycled Blood Moon event in Stranglethorn Vale, which, yes, while I think the event overall is a good PvP event, it's still nothing new or exciting. There wasn't many dungeons available to us like there was during Phase 2, we only got access to Mara, Zul'Farrak and the lesser exciting half of Blackrock Depths, most of which was just players again speedrunning princess runs in Mara for the wild offerings. The Sunken Temple raid is alright, and with some new bosses they had done a great job in making it into a raid, but again it came with a lot of problems. The most notable one for most players is the fact that it's 20-man raids. Now, to be honest, I personally am quite fond of larger raid sizes such as 20-man raids, as it really feels much more immersive within the raid itself, and just the overall feeling making it feel more like a raid than a glorified dungeon. However, I completely understand and agree that for probably the large majority of the player base, 20-man raiding hindered them and their guild, as it makes it less accessible to gather 20 players consistently on the same day and the same time each and every week. The raid itself had also released way too difficult for its target audience within Season of Discovery, and even after all of the nerfs to make the bosses more accessible, there was still way too much trash within the raid for most people's liking, as they typically look at Season of Discovery as a more casual approach and don't want to spend more than 2 hours in a raid. But the biggest issue with Phase 3 by far was the fact that incursions were released completely broken. Incursions was supposed to be one of the biggest parts of this phase's content, but instead it caused such a rift between players, as while it looked promising and it sounded like a great alternative way to level, the reality is that the incursions themselves were completely boring. While they may have took a classic WoW concept from the Silithus badge duty quests, as a long-time classic player, I can quite confidently say I don't know anyone who enjoyed that process during Phase 5 of classic WoW. Outside of that, nothing about incursions felt like classic WoW. And we got to remember that although Season of Discovery is a new take on WoW, it is still based on classic WoW as a whole. The grassroots of the game is still vanilla WoW at its core. Not only this, but incursions far outweighed the amount of experience and gold you would have got in any other leveling route. And if you missed out on the early incursion spam, you also missed out on an insane amount of gold that was injected into the game and directly affected how the economy shaped within Season of Discovery. So although I personally don't think that Phase 3 was a complete disaster, it also wasn't anywhere near as good as the previous phases, which leaves the player base and the current state of the game at a bit of an impasse. There hasn't been much information regarding Season of Discovery as of late. It feels like they are keeping it very hush, which hopefully means they are working on very big and exciting things for Phase 4. As we know, there will be generally a lot of content in Phase 4, from level 50 to 60, all of the dungeons, professions, tier 0.5 quest lines, all of the raids and much more. We already know that they're working on all new loot for the early stages of being max level. They've already teased that they're working on completely new tier sets, as previously in vanilla, tier sets were typically aimed at only one certain spec, and sometimes the sets were just straight up bad. Phase 4 is the point where it's the true end game for many players, as that's when the real raids will come into effect, when we'll have max level with all of our runes, talent points and abilities. So it feels like Season of Discovery is currently in a state where it could either shoot back up in popularity or it could crash, depending on the content that will be released during the next phase. If the level 60 content is good, the runes are interesting and fully flesh out classes, class balance is acted upon now we're at max level and the only things that can alter your power moving forward is the different types of gear that you get, meaning it's much easier to balance. A new PvP event to match having Alterac Valley as a reputation, maybe some tweaking of the most iconic dungeons in World of Warcraft such as a reimagined Upper Blackrock Spire or Strathholm, and so much more could completely ignite the player base once again. But I think the biggest tipping point will be on how Molten Core turns out as a raid. We already know it's going to be scaled down to 20 player, but if the raid itself is released and it completely exceeds the expectation of what players want, then I truly believe Season of Discovery could play a major part in the success of WoW over the coming 6 to 12 months, potentially reaching the numbers of the previous Phase 1 player base, or even exceeding it if they really smash it out of the park. However, on the flip side to this, I feel that if Molten Core is released and it's just a lousy, toned down version and the other level 60 content during Phase 4 just doesn't quite meet the high expectation that the players want from the game, then Season of Discovery itself could be in big trouble and risk slowly bleeding out. As a true classic player, I really hope that Phase 4 does well, as I believe Season of Discovery and a new potential more permanent Classic Plus could definitely be the future of World of Warcraft. And if there's any version of WoW that's capable of making such an enormous impact on the sub count for World of Warcraft in terms of new player base or returning player base, then Classic WoW, as we've previously saw with the release in 2019, is the version that is capable of becoming incredibly successful once again. And with that, we've come to the end of the video. Please let me know your thoughts on where Phase 4 could take Season of Discovery. I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video.